Friends, today's NRI Samai program from Los Angeles brought to you commercial free by listeners like you. Your generous donations make possible for us to stay commercial free, and today's show is pre-recorded. If you have a question for the guest, please send an email to nrisamai@gmail.com. We will follow up with the guest and find the answer for you. Thank you for your support.
Hello, friends. This is Anare Samai, and this is your host, Vamsi Allah. Today we have a very distinguished guest. He is Muzaffar Chishti. He is the director of Migration Policy Institute at the New York University School of Law. Hello, sir. How are you?
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
This is our privilege, sir. Before we go off, I'd like to just give you a brief introductory note of who you are to our audience. And I'm reading this, and I'm amazed by your accomplishments so far. Dr. Muzaffar Chishti is a lawyer by profession. His work focuses on U.S. immigration policy, civil liberties, and immigrant integration. He has served as chair of the board of directors of the National Immigration Forum and as a member of the American Bars Association Coordinating Committee of Immigration. He has authored several articles about immigration, and he has testified extensively on immigration policy before the Congressional Committee. He has given several interviews to radio and TV about these important matters. And as far as education goes, he was educated at the University of Delhi, Cornell Law School, and the Columbia School of International Affairs. I mean, that going by this list, I mean, I'm just struck in awe. Welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Right. So the primary reason I actually tried to reach out to you was to discuss the current Syrian Refugee Crisis. Can you briefly explain what the crisis is to our audience, please, sir?
Well, the crisis has kind of hit this proportion only in the last month or so in public eye, and the sort of the focused attention that's been placed on this by the media. But frankly, it has been a crisis that has been in the making for close to 18 months to 2 years. It stems principally from the conflict in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, remnants of the activities of the Islamic State, and to some extent even from Afghanistan. So we have had an outflow of people from that region, mostly for reasons of political dissent or simple safety, and some for economic reasons, who have left the region. Many of them have been settled in, at least for temporary purposes, in the neighboring countries.
Right.
The principal of them has been Jordan and Lebanon. But now, in the last year or so, there's been increased pressure of migration flows into Europe, and that's what's caused the new so-called crisis that we have seen unfold in the last couple of months.
Right. I mean, from what you say, so the crisis has been in the making for last couple of years. We are only getting to know this from the media coverage, and especially from the horrific images that we saw of a boy drowning in the ocean on the shores of Greece. It's a shame that we have to know this through horrific images. Until then, just like humanity doesn't even bother to know. Is that a fitting thing, and why is it so that way?
Well, it's unfortunately true of all international crises. I mean, the press has very little bandwidth. It has very little time span of attention on anything. I mean, people who follow the refugee crisis from these parts of the world have known that countries like Lebanon and Jordan have been dealing with for a very, very long period of time. There are close to more than 1 million refugees from the region in both those countries. So international community has known it for a long time. The reason why, your colleagues in the press get intrigued is only when they, for a brief period of time, they get attracted to certain images. That's the nature of this beast. And I think the first recent crisis that happened was in Austria when about 80 people were found dead in a truck.
Right.
And that sort of was one of the turning points.
Yeah. Let's give a idea as to how many were displaced. Like, I mean, to give a magnitude of this crisis that's happening in Syria and the Middle East, do we have a number of how many were displaced and that are trying to enter other countries through this crisis right now?
Well, it's a number changing every day.
Right.
I mean, it's estimated that there may be 4 million people either who already left or in the process of leaving. We know that all intelligent sort of experts in Europe think that Europe may get 4,000 to 5,000 people a day in the next few months. I mean, if you just look at the number, you're looking at potentially 1 million people trying to cross into the European countries within the next year. We know that more than 2.5 million people are already in Lebanon and in Jordan. So the volume is very, very high. What is different about the current flow into Europe is that it is of those people who had chosen to stay in Syria for as long as they could. Lebanon and Jordan got initial flow of refugees, people who left the war-torn area. These people, many of them are middle class, many of them are professionals. They had chosen to stay. And I think now they're finding the condition untenable for their own stay. And that's the new sort of the profile of the refugees that you see entering the European countries.
Right, I mean, millions. I mean, as you say, it's 4 million, and some estimates put it at even at 6 and 7 million. That's like a phenomenon. It's more like an exodus than just a small crisis. But the thing is, given these numbers, it's just impossible for these poor folks to walk away. What are some of the means that these poor folks try to reach Hungary? I mean, we have visions of kids drowning from the boats, and then there are some 80 people that were found in a truck. I mean, are they using some mafia? Are they that's involved with this transportation of people? Are they just walking across the border? How does this migration happen?
I mean, that's a good question. I think we do know that the routes are well known. There is the people come to Turkey, is a rather favorite point of departure. They make it to Turkey sometimes by.
And I'm assuming the border with Turkey is very porous. Is that how?
Porous, and many people are just taking flights. They're taking flights from
Syria.
From Syria to Istanbul, or from Damascus to Istanbul, and then going to a port city. They come to Greece. They come to Siberia, Macedonia, into Hungary, and that's why the Balkans and the East European countries have become central to this discussion, because they're essentially gateways of entree to Western Europe. And what we do know is that the smuggling networks in these countries are very potent. They are the people who typically operate in the countries from which you make the departure, and they arrange the passage sea. What has changed from what we understand in the last 2 or 3 months is that the smuggling networks are also operating in Europe. So the reach of the smuggling networks is not just in the departing ports, but inside Europe, and that's a very significant development, I think, of the kind and magnitude we have not seen in refugee crises in Europe, I think, ever. So I think that has brought much more attention to that end of this problem than we had seen in the past.
Right. I mean, as a response to this, I mean, there is international response. But before we get to the response of the international nations, where is UN in this? There's hardly a talk about UN taking an active role in this. Why is UN not playing any major role in this? Is this because of the crisis within Europe and the leadership not wanting anybody meddling with these affairs? What's your take on the minor role that UN has been playing in this crisis at this point?
Well, I'm not sure you can call it minor. I mean, United Nations, the UN Commission for UNHCR is the main High Commissioner for Refugees is the main organization which is supposed to be the initial point of entree for screening of these people. UNHCR's job is to make sure that people who seek refuge in any country meet the refugee definition.
Okay.
And the refugee definition under the UN Convention is a very strict one. Not everyone who flees a country is a refugee.
Okay.
You have to fit certain very limited criteria. You must be fleeing because you have faced persecution on the basis of your political opinion or race or national origin, ethnicity. Those are their very limited categories. That's the mandate of the United Nations or High Commissioner for Refugees. The problem with the present crisis is that the flow is so rapid and intense that it's very difficult for UNHCR to open any camps for processing people to register for refugee status. They're just overwhelmed. And so once you're overwhelmed, you can't really do justice to the process for which you were set up. And I think that's why there's been less visible response on the part of, from what you see on the part of the UNHCR, because in this kind of an exodus, they just become less and less relevant to the onslaught. There is a UN rapporteur on migration and development. He has been urging European Union countries for the last 1 year to have a more concerted response. Again, it's all about, it's the way the press focus works. As UNHCR's work does not get focused, the two pictures in Austria and the Turkish shoreline get a lot of attention. So there's a lot of scope here for blame, but there's also a lot of blame to be placed, frankly, on the sort of the hot attention given to press on certain kind of things. But the most important factor to understand is that this is an extraordinary, unprecedented crisis. Certainly in world refugee situation in general, and in the European refugee situation in particular. Europe probably has not had this kind of refugee crisis since the 50s. So that's why I think the tension in the air is much more palpable than you would normally imagine in any refugee situation.
Right. I mean, going back to the numbers, I'm just really surprised and astonished by these numbers. Like Lebanon, as of now, is handling 1.5 million refugees. Jordan, unofficially estimated at 1.4, but UN has it at around 600,000, which is about 20% of Jordan's population, right? And Turkey has about 1.9 million Syrians. I mean, these are huge.
These are huge numbers, and they don't get attention because. Compared because they're not in the Western world, but they have been taking a good chunk of this population for a long. I think Lebanon's like 25% of the population now.
25% of its population is what they're taking as refugees. But I mean, this has to have a lot of impact on these host nations, right? I mean, Lebanon, Jordan, they're really small compared to Turkey, and they're taking in 20% of refugees compared to their population. It has to have a lot of impact. What is the impact of these refugees on these nations?
Well, the impact of the refugees on these nations is what it is in many ways for a lot of countries, and some countries have the ability to absorb that impact more than other countries have. So these countries, in many of these refugee camps, the camps are fine and they do provide basic services or sustenance, but they're also very porous. I mean, people leave the camps. And they sometimes go and commingle with their other relatives, ethnic groups, communities, and then they sort of enter the local labor market. If you enter the local labor market, obviously, then you compete with the jobs for the natives in those societies, and that creates its own tension. So clearly, these countries are dealing with potentially large impact. And what they're hoping is that this is a temporary phenomenon. What they're hoping is that some kind of order will be restored in the region where people will be willing to go back. In the meantime, it should be noted that some of these countries are getting aid from the Western world for housing the refugees.
Okay.
That may not be enough to assuage their fears, but it at least is some help, and more needs to be done in that area.
Right. I mean, when I was thinking of this story a couple of weeks ago, the Western nations were mostly not willing to take in these refugees. Now that their talking points have changed, and they are in fact taking these, and with a smaller number than we would expect. But the question for most citizens in U.S. as well as in Europe may be, why should we take these refugees? What's your response to that?
Well, that's it's a very age-old question in movement of people.
Right.
There is a legal responsibility and there's a moral responsibility.
Okay.
The legal responsibility comes from our obligations under the UN Convention, which is the 1951 Convention, which basically says that no country shall deport people from their land if they meet the refugee definition. If they're fleeing persecution on the basis of X, Y, Z, the 5 factors that I mentioned earlier, which is, political opinion, race, nationality, ethnicity, other such social factors, that you have an obligation to keep those people under the UN Convention. So there's legal obligation.
Right.
And there's obviously moral obligation. And moral obligation is that this is a collective responsibility of all civilized people, that when people are in desperate situation like this, we must come to their aid. The issue becomes that there's then a national response and there's a collective global response. So the issue is, where does your national obligation end and where does your collective response as a member of the international community start? And that's, I think, what will be a big challenge here. For the European countries, this is really a very critical moment for Europe. I don't think they expected it. I think it is generally believed that Europe waited too long to have a response to the crisis.
Right.
That Europeans really started having a much more focused response only when it reached this crisis proportion, that if preparation had been made early on, this would have been probably a little more smooth. But having done that, European Union is getting tested. One of the defining moments about the European Union is sort of common borders, and and sort of once in the refugee crisis, as we saw with respect to Hungary and standoff with Austria and Germany, the definition of open borders is highly tested. So Europe has to decide how much of it is their national responsibility and how much of it is their collective European responsibility. The rest of us in the world have to see that, look, this may be very close to the European border, this crisis, which is why they're facing it. But at the end of the day, this is the responsibility of all of us. And that's why I think there is more and more call for a global response to this, and not just a European or a regional Middle Eastern response to this.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting that you mentioned two points, legal as well as moral. Moral is, I think, moral obligation is pretty straightforward. We can understand. From legal, this is something that I'm learning. But then, way back in May 2015, I think you are aware, the Rohingya Muslims from Burma and Bangladesh, they were trying to seek refugee from their host nations to on boats, right? I mean, and they were stranded in boats, and Thailand, Indonesia, Australia, they all have refused taking them in. So if there is a legal responsibilities for these nations, why were they allowed to deny, and where is the enforcer here? I mean, is there any enforcer of this legal mandate of these nations to take refugees? I mean, by all means, these Rohingya Muslims from Burma and Bangladesh, they define, I think they come under the criteria of refugee definition, right?
Well, it depends on, you can't broadly say, but I have a lot of sympathy with the Rohingya refugees, but you can't broadly say that about everyone. Not everyone who is, that's why, unfortunately, this becomes very technical, is that to define that someone is covered by the UN Convention definition, you have to screen them. You have to get them, you have to register them, you have to interview them, you have to process them, and then you come up with the determination that they are subject to the convention protection. Now, that's hard to do on a mass scale. We don't know how many of them were screened that way. But we do know ultimately that, first of all, obviously the refugee in the Southeast Asia do not get the same kind of focused press attention as refugees in Europe.
I mean, is it because it is Europe? Is it because the scale of this 6 million as against 6,000 in Southeast, or is it something else going on?
Everything. It's everything. It's the proximity to Europe. European countries, obviously responded to this in a crisis way. Mm-hmm. They sought a collective response in a crisis way. The Southeast Asian countries, I think, frankly, did not. Thailand got the good brunt of the refugee crisis. I mean, from what I know, Thailand, frankly, sat in the same category as Lebanon and Jordan. That the principal burden is carried by contiguous countries.
Right.
And Thailand happened to be the contiguous country. It landed up taking a lot of those refugees. I think by now experts believe that 95% of the refugees in the world actually do get protection in the contiguous countries.
Right.
Now, is that a good thing or bad thing? For physical proximity, that makes a lot of sense. But for global sharing, it doesn't make sense. The Rohingya refugees should have gotten much more attention than they got. Frankly, the refugees from the Middle Eastern countries should have gotten much more attention that they got, and they didn't get attention, the point I made earlier, till very recently. So it's not that the crisis, that there is always a differentiated treatment. It varies a lot, frankly, by the press attention. And it varies a lot then by the response of the countries and the form of response that it takes. That, I think, is a lot to explain between what happened with the Rohingya refugees and what's happening in the Middle Eastern refugees into Europe.
Friends, NRI Samay is a non-profit independent alternate media from Los Angeles, USA, which brings positive stories from grassroots activists from all corners of India and across the world. NRI Summit does not rely on corporate funding, and our shows are commercial free. We only rely on your donations. Corporate funded media is driven by the TRP rating, and profits are blurring the distinction between news and entertainment. Why do our news channels talk so much about cricket, movies, accidents, popular figures' personal lives, babies of heroines, gossips, etc., while they should be covering the struggles of people, inequality in our society, rural issues, and border security issues? Why did our media raise some corruption crusaders to the sky on one day and shut them off completely when graft charges were raised on those corporate sponsors? Media relies so much on the corporate funding and government blessings that they cannot report independently. NRI Samay is different. We don't accept funds from any corporations, and hence our shows are commercial free. We completely rely on donations from you. Please consider donating to NRI Samay, and please go to nrisamay.com and donate generously. This is the only way together that we can continue NRI Samay. All donations are kept transparent on nrisamay.com. And if you have any questions, please write to nrisamay@gmail.com.
Bringing back to the Syrian crisis, that the contiguous nations have more refugees coming in. But then, I mean, if you look at Syria and its bordering nations, there's Israel, which is closer, which is next bordering to Jordan, and they seem to have refused taking in any refugees, and there has been no coverage about why it's not, and why is it because the borders are closed? Is it because of the conflict within Middle East between Israel and its neighboring nations?
Well, again, this is one of these things where there is this very delicate balance between your national sovereignty and your international obligations. I mean, we could make the same argument about our own country. The United States has taken 1,500 Syrian refugees.
Right.
We are the world's, richest country. We are the only superpower. And why should we take so few? And again, at some level, it was a sovereign decision made by our own government, and which in this case means both by Congress and by the administration. And with respect to the Syrian refugees, in fact, the refugees in the whole region, this has been true since 9/11. We have under our refugee law now special determination for screening for terrorism. Mm-hmm. That people are concerned that in the guise of coming as refugees, that people should not bring in elements of terrorism. So we have to actually screen every refugee for lack of their terrorist ties, which makes the processing extremely complicated. It's very labor intensive. All lawyers who deal with the treatment of refugees from that part of the world will tell you how onerous that issue is. You could argue that Israel is applying the same lens to the refugees in that part of the world, and it will say, look, we have to concern about our own domestic concerns, and we have to be concerned about our own ability to absorb, which is the argument many Eastern European countries are making today when they are confronted with the flow from the Mediterranean.
Yeah, it's a sad situation, but I mean, at least I thought Germany and European nations had much more pressure taking in these than Israel at all. And also, I mean, if we're talking about the neighbors, the rich Middle Eastern nations like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, they haven't taken any. Iran, Iraq, there's not much talk about refugees in that region. I mean, the same argument goes with these nations as well?
Exactly. It's about their national sovereignty. I mean, frankly, the Gulf countries historically and today have taken much fewer refugees than even Israel. I mean, Israel has taken some Eritreans in the past. I think even in the recent conflict has taken some Eritreans, but on the scale, obviously, nowhere close to what other countries have done. But the Gulf countries have, historically taken almost none. Mm. And again, it's the same argument, is that they are weighing their domestic concerns with their obligation internationally, and their argument is that our societies are not sort of assimilable societies. The conflicts here are deep-drawn. I mean, that's why a lot of people explain the phenomenon of many of these Gulf countries relying on labor, especially in the low-wage sectors of the occupations from South Asia and Southeast Asia, than from the region itself. I mean, there was initially many of these Gulf countries would take workers from Jordan and Palestine and Egypt, and then they switched that in favor of labor from South Asia and Southeast Asia, precisely for the same reason, that they thought that the internal conflict between migrants that they got from other parts of the region created much more political conflict for them than from migrants who came from Southeast Asia and South Asia. And that's how that move happened. And that lens has, I think, managed to stay with Gulf countries when it has looked at the processing of the new flow from Syria and Iraq. It's unfortunate, but it's true.
Right. It seems like, I mean, they're getting a clean pass. where there shouldn't be. Seems like we are using a double standards on these nations, whereas Europe and US seems to be getting more, the brunt of the criticism. At least that's in my opinion.
Yeah, I think they will argue that they're providing financial aid.
Financial aid.
And the argument is that may be true, but financial aid in this kind of crisis does not wash your moral responsibility.
Right.
When the dimension of a crisis this kind. Financial aid is good, but you also have to take more burden sharing in respect to the settlement of refugees.
Right.
So yes, so it's not the more important point here to be made is that this is really a global crisis. And it does need, I think, a shared responsibility among all the actors in the world. We can't any longer say this is something for the regional actors to respond to, like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, nor can we say it is just the responsibility of the Europeans. This has really become a global responsibility.
Right. When I think about this global responsibility, that there are two things I see. Right. One is the imminent crisis, which is the refugees, taking care of these refugees, where host nations take them in. That's one problem. And then the second is the source of the problem is the civil war or the internal crisis that Syria is having. Which does it require an international intervention either by U.S. or UN? Do you feel so, or that seems to be the cause of this? And if they don't stop this crisis is going to be an ever continuing one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So the ultimate solution here is what you do to the root problem.
Right.
This to keep on the rate of the hemorrhage is
right.
just so intense that this is not going to become a sustainable situation for very long. As I said early on, one of the more interesting aspects of the recent flow is that these are now people who had really decided to stay on there for
right.
a long time, and they are now having to change their mind. That many of them were parts of the institutions of these governments. They no longer can see themselves staying on for their own future. They want to resume their lives somewhere else. And therefore, this situation is unsustainable, and the only way to deal with this is the source issue. And in many ways, therefore, the refugee crisis or the current focus on this refugee crisis may be a silver lining about world had taken sort of a pass at not dealing with the root problem. And the root problem is obviously the disorder in Syria and in Libya, in Iraq, frankly.
Right.
And so for that, I don't know whether you mean military intervention, but it certainly needs much more of an international focus. And to me, what needs to happen are, first of all, much more sort of attention by Soviet Union and the U.S. in
right.
terms of they have the maximum leverage in Syria. And
okay.
so far there hasn't been much coordination of what could be led to a lasting sort of, we're not even calling a permanent solution. You're just calling about sort of stopping of atrocity, sort of bringing some semblance of order to that country.
Right.
I think that the four most important countries in that equation are Soviet Union and U.S. on one hand. It doesn't necessarily mean military intervention, but it means coordination of the efforts.
Right.
And then on the other hand, unfortunately, it also means forces in the region, which principally means Iran and Saudi Arabia. They have the most
right.
clout in the warring factions
right.
in these areas, and unless you stop the warring factions from being at each other's throats, the situation in terms of basic order cannot be brought into control.
Right. So the thinking even more, we have this crisis which is in millions, but then in May we had a crisis in Thailand from the Rohingya. how many? I mean, I'm assuming there are much more other places, flashpoints, where this is happening and that are not being talked about. Do we have a estimate of how many flashpoints there are, how many people are displaced, and at this point, do you have any numbers just for?
Yeah, it's at a historic high, unfortunately. I mean, I think the figures by all experts who follow this on the global level believe that there may be actually pretty close to 60 million people today.
60 million people.
60 million people today.
Wow.
Who are living outside their countries and regions of origin. That's extraordinary.
And that's historically at a high number.
That's historically the highest number.
Wow.
There are people who are on from their traditional places of settlement. There's 60 million. It doesn't mean they're all refugees. It means they are either political refugees, they're refugees from war-torn conditions, they are economic migrants, they are people from fleeing from economic degradation in their places of origin. But these are people who are living outside the traditional homes. Now that's historic high. Now the flashpoints on this are, they're well known. I mean, it is the Middle East is a huge part of it and has been for quite some time.
Right.
I think the developments in the last 2 decades have been unsettling, and whenever you have an unsettling phenomenon, the first thing it does is it creates exodus of people.
Right.
So you have a large set of flashpoints in the Middle East. It's not just the Iraq war, it's the Afghan. I mean, just think about Afghan refugees still in Pakistan.
Right.
and in India. And that war has been over for many years.
Right.
It still is a going. Look at Kurds in all 3 countries that sort of surround that part of the world. The Iraqis in all neighboring countries. Then you have Syrians in every neighboring country that they fled to. You have then Libya in an extremely explosive situation, and you have parts of Africa which have produced everyone from Congo to Eritrea, Somalia, and they use the Middle Eastern. They use the sort of the upper parts of the African Middle Eastern countries as routes then to come to crossing the Mediterranean into Europe. So these are the big flashpoints that are producing the largest numbers of refugees today, in addition to the Rohingyas that you talked about early.
Right.
We have had our own situation on the Western Hemisphere of people fleeing from Haiti. Haiti was a big source of refugees to the U.S. in the 1980s and the 90s. That has somewhat been stopped now, but always a flashpoint. There's obviously the Southeast Asian crisis that you talked about with respect to Rohingyas. So I would say these are the major flashpoints in the world for the production of forced migration.
Right. Those are huge numbers. I mean, historically high numbers, if you say. And
I mean, you haven't even looked at again in terms of wherever the press is not focused attention, it
right.
doesn't give
right.
attention. I mean, Ukrainians into Russia,
right.
All parts of Central Asia. If you go to a place like Moscow, it is full of people from the former Soviet republics.
Right.
Coming into Moscow to, whether you call them economic refugees or migrants or political refugees, it's very hard to distinguish. But there are a huge number of internal movements in those in that region also.
Right. I mean, and most of these are mostly about political instability in these nations, and sometimes it's also some ethnic clashes as well. And is there any hope for betterment in the future? I mean, it looks like U.S. and UN are very shy in intervening. I'm not talking militarily, but even as a mediation, for example, in Syria, I would assume, given the crisis, the U.S. would get in on the ground and mediate between ISIS and Syria, but they are kind of shying away from that. But there, like you said, there are many other flashpoints, and we are at a crisis where 60 million are in this situation. Is this a thing to? Are we to expect more of this crisis happening? Are we to expect some settlement in the near future?
Well, we don't. With all flashpoints, you can. If we could all predict the flashpoints, they would not be flashpoints.
Right.
It's very hard to predict world situation. I mean, people thought that the Arab Spring would bring stability to that part of the world.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it did not. It did not work out the way people expected it to work. So it's hard to, frankly, predict what the future of the Flashpoints is. But all we can do is we can try to contain the situations as much as we can. So I think in the case of the present Middle Eastern crisis, I think there probably is some need for some kind of an extraordinary international meeting on this subject, in a way that we haven't had, so that European Union countries have their own collective response, but they don't feel they're the only ones who have to share the burden. So I think in that context, I think getting a collective gathering of all countries of the world and asking them to take share in the burden of the current crisis is an important development. And once people get focused on that, then the second most important thing to do is whether you can notch up the response to the root causes. And there, I think this crisis, may force people to just do that, is to be engaged in a way that they were not engaged in the past. That's sometimes crises do have a way of creating their own sort of unforeseen solution. So here you may have a situation where the refugee crisis has come home in such a stark way that it's very hard for European countries and for U.S. and Canada to be on the sidelines. So therefore, if that is the result, and that may help sort of alleviate some of the root causes, that would be a good outcome.
Right. I mean, I think we're running a little bit short on time. I think we have 5 more minutes. I think we can wrap this up. Bringing this question back to U.S., I mean, we are in a presidential election cycle right now, and most of the Republican candidates' rhetoric has been with respect to immigration, right? Is going from a wide range, like closing the borders and stating that migration, legal as well as illegal, causes economic hardship on the states. It increases crime. It takes away jobs. Is there any truth to each one of these arguments? I mean, there may be more arguments that make, but these are the 3 that come to my mind. First thing is that these legal as well as illegal immigrants cause economic hardship on the states that they come in, either through welfare or non-welfare costs. They increase the crime and then take away the jobs that the locals would have. Is there merit into any of this? If so, if not, what's your take on this?
Well, immigration sort of becomes a favorite topic in every election cycle.
Right.
So it's not a surprise that even in periods of prosperity, immigration sort of rises to the high level of political discourse and elections.
I mean, is it because it's an easy talking point?
Oh, I'm sorry?
Is it because it's an easy talking point?
Well, because no, it's not just a talking point. I mean, it does go into deep reserves of people's anxiety.
Right.
When you're not economically doing well yourself, you don't feel very generous towards others.
Right.
That's not a new phenomenon. So there's clearly a section of the society which is feeling economically alienated. It feels sort of socially alienated. So the idea of talking about immigrants becomes a very easy rallying point, if nothing else, and that's exactly what some of the Republican presidential candidates have gone into. By the way, the same is true for Europe. I mean, why it's not easy thing in Europe is that it's not clear that the body politic all supports receiving the new refugees. So that's why they had, political parties have to be responsive to their own political constituents. So it's never easy. But frankly, in the U.S. context, this is not a surprise. Right. This happens in every election cycle. It lasts for a little while, and then the majority opinion prevails. Luckily, in the majority opinion today, there is strong consensus for immigration in the United States. This is no matter how you see the rhetoric. The fact is that we still take 1 million people a year as lawful permanent residents.
Right.
That's more than the rest of the world combined takes.
Right.
Luckily for us, no one, even in this rhetorical race, has been talking about reducing legal immigration.
Right.
The debate has really focused on unauthorized immigration, about our borders and about our controls within the society. Now that is unfortunate, but it should be expected in election year. It's not the majority opinion, and I think this has a flip side, is that this works very well in the primary election to reach out to their base, but those remarks that you make in the primary election sometimes come to hurt you in the general election, and that is unfortunately some of the risk that many of the political candidates are running when they come close to the general election.
Right. Right. I think we are on the time. I can go and talk to you. I mean, this is a phenomenal intellectual discussion, and I am really honored to have you, sir.
Thank you very much for chatting with you, sir.
Yeah, I hope we can have you some other time, and thank you very much for taking your time, sir.
Thanks
have a nice
so
day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Friends, if you liked today's show, please go to youtube.com/NRI Samay and click on the subscribe button. You will get notified every time we publish a new show. And you can also like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+.